I couldn't tell you the number of times that I've read this passage. But in going over the commentaries and consulting various other places, I realized I was confronted with a truth that comes out of this passage that I had never seen before. And quite frankly, it blew me away to the point where I'm like, okay, I need to bring this up because I don't want you guys to have to go through this and miss this truth, because this is so revelatory about the nature of God. And it's for those of you that go to the forums, you probably remember a little while ago, I put up these little articles called Winged Wonderings. I'll put them up every once in a while. I think I've only got 2 at the moment, but my latest one was on paradoxes and talking about just how Christianity is kind of this conglomerate of paradoxes, things that that you'd expect to go one way but go a completely different one because of the nature of God and how God is the great balancer, and he uses, as we say, he uses the weak or the foolish of this world to confound the strong, and things like that. Well, this is another passage that kind of turns what you'd expect on its head. So, bearing that in mind, could I get someone to read that passage, Romans 11:17 through 24? And I know we don't have an orange light, but I'm okay with that. Just if you want to do it, just type in the chat and I'll call on you or whatever. ADT has an orange light.
Romans 11:17 to 24.
Yes, sir.
Yes. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree?
Thank you. Okay. So if you've been at church, if you're like me, you went to Sparky's and Awanas and were sitting in a Bible believing church, you have undoubtedly heard this metaphor of the church, specifically the Gentile church, being grafted into the family of God. It's something that comes up a fair bit. And so this is the passage where this whole idea comes from. Now, I'll get to this later, but you guys know what grafting is, right? When I say grafted, when Paul talks about grafting, you guys know what we're talking about, right?
Right.
Okay. Anybody that doesn't understand the concept of grafting? Orange light if you don't. Yes. Webcaster is Winged Feet, by the way. And goat. Okay. Sparky's is like Awana Jr. Sorry. But Ribzaster is actually she took horticulture for a number of years, so I consulted with her in preparation for this. So I have her seal of approval. But what we talked about last week was this idea of how or what we've been talking about throughout the last I guess, the last few Bible studies is this idea of Israel's role versus the role of the Gentiles in this age in which Paul finds himself writing to the Romans. How the Jews in mass have rejected the Messiah, and so as a result, the message of the gospel has turned mostly from the Jews to the Gentiles. And so it's under that idea that Paul is writing these verses here. So he says, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, even though you're a wild olive shoot, and we'll come back to that, were grafted in among the others and now share in the nourishing root of the olive, don't be arrogant towards the other branches. Now, why would that be a problem? What do you think Paul is really trying to address here? Why would these other branches be arrogant?
Because they were added.
Okay. Keza says replacement hubris. Unger says because they were added. What's significant about that? Okay, Reb Zaster. Yeah, you're getting there. They were chosen to be brought in. Yeah, exactly. You guys have got it. Essentially, the idea is that, look, these branches weren't good enough, so they came out and got us to replace them because we were better than these branches, and so we're the ones that are most fit to be the branches on this tree. And Paul says, no. No, just no. He says, if you remember, it is not you who supports the root, but the root that supports you. And that's true. If you've ever looked at a tree, you know that the root is where the life comes from. Sure, the branches have leaves and everything, and that helps, but the main role of the branch is to produce the fruit, and most of the nourishment that the plant is going to get comes from the roots. And so it's the root that supports the branches. And then he kind of anticipates a response from these Gentiles that hypothetically would say this. I was, side note, I was kind of impressed by a term I came across in this. It was Gentile Pharisees. I had never seen that term before, and I love it. Because the problem with the Jewish Pharisees is that they believed that their position was such that they were God's chosen because they kept the law, they had this heritage and such, and so they believed it was their right and it was just theirs by right to be the chosen ones of Israel, to be God's chosen people. And that's kind of the same idea of these Gentiles that would make this argument. Their hubris comes out in thinking, well, look at what God has done for us. We must be so important because God put us here, as opposed to those Jews, which were of the natural line of God's chosen people. So I thought that was cool. I was like, I'd never heard the term Gentile Pharisee, but I like it. It makes a lot of sense. So these Gentile Pharisees say, well, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. And at first read that, that looks innocent enough. Branches were broken off so they could be grafted in. That's true. And even Paul admits that in the first part of verse 20. He says, that's true. But this verse in the original Greek is less about this statement as a fact. It's more about a focus on the individual. It's like, well, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. It's like they had to get rid of other stuff. They had to knock off some of this trashiness, this useless stuff, so that I could be put in to save the day. That's kind of the connotation of verse 19. And Paul says, well, it's true that you were grafted in, but it's kind of said with this sense of sarcasm, almost. He says they were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. And so now we see the contrast that Paul has already alluded to several times in Romans, the idea of faith versus works. And this is where things really kind of take shape. Yeah. This is where that thing that I had never seen came into play. Is in verses 21 through 24. It says, "For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you." And he says, "Note the kindness and the severity of God, severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you will be cut off." What the part that really gets me is in verse 24. He says, "For if you were cut from by what is nature a wild olive tree and grafted," and then there's this little phrase that we kind of miss, "contrary to nature." It's easy to jump over that. What do you think Paul means by that statement, contrary to nature? That's true, Kessa. Grafting generally doesn't occur except by human intervention. Yeah, it's not a naturally occurring event. It's not like a tree just was like, "Hey, you want this branch?" Throws it to another one. Yeah, Rebzaster knows because I discussed this with her. Go ahead, Wash.
I was gonna say because a wild olive branch won't generally graft into a cultivated one very
Why
easily.
not? Why not?
They're kind of a different species at that point. One's gone through a lot of different changes, and
Okay. Here's the thing. When it comes to grafting, what is the purpose of grafting in horticulture and agriculture? What are you trying to do?
Make better fruit.
Make better fruit? Yep, make better fruit, make more fruit. It's generally designed to increase or improve your crop, your harvest. Right? More better. Exactly. And so how would most farmers achieve this? If you're familiar with grafting, do you how would you do that? Oh, Cappy has an O. Cappy, go ahead.
You would just simply cycle crops of land every 2 or 3 years.
That's not necessarily grafting. That's just that's a crop cycle so that different nutrients get pulled out of the soil at different times. You see that all over the Midwest, primarily with like pickles, soy, corn, and such.
Okay, then. I was wrong.
No, I'll take this one. The way you generally do it is a graft happens when you cut a branch, generally one that's fruitful, like has a bud or a flower on the end of it, one that's showing promise. You'll cut that one off and then secure it either with the same kind of cut and then tying it onto another branch that doesn't have anything growing on it. And that way, this branch that doesn't have any fruit will suddenly have one in hopes that this tree that wasn't producing a lot will suddenly start producing because it has a fruit grown on it, and the original tree that you got it from will keep producing like it was. And so now, instead of just having one tree making fruit, now you have two. Doctor, the contrary to nature phrase is in verse 24. Yes, roughly. You're the horticulturalist. But the whole idea of this kind of grafting is that you're always taking from a good tree and putting it on an inferior tree. Right? You're taking from a tree that's producing fruit and putting it on a tree that isn't producing fruit. Right? Does that make sense?
Why would it be an inferior tree?
Maybe not inferior is not a right word, but it's making less fruit. It's
Oh,
not
I mean, in
producing-
the example, like what does that allude to?
I'm not sure I get the question. Maybe because I'm not done with it.
Sorry.
But in this case, what we have is we have this fruitful tree, this allusion to the cultivated olive tree, this one that is supported by the true vine, this covenant promise given by God. Then we have all these other trees, these wild olive trees that aren't producing in the same way, these Gentile trees that have no connection to God, that bear no godly fruit. And yet, what does God do? He goes to the trees that aren't producing any godly fruit, and he grafts those into a better tree. This is what Paul means by that which is contrary to nature. Whereas farmers will almost always take a tree that is producing fruit and graft its branches into one that isn't producing fruit, what God did with us is he took from trees that weren't producing fruit and put it onto a tree that was, so that they would produce fruit. And in all of my years of reading over this passage, I never once got that. But that goes back to so many different passages. Probably the most easy, the easiest correlation to make would be back to John 15. I am the vine, you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing. That's why we're grafted in, because apart from him, on any other tree, we produce nothing. You guys with me on this?
Yes.
I think rather than look at it as an olive tree, look at it as corn, because we see a lot more of that here in the U.S. That
Okay, and that's fair.
Natural corn is, you wouldn't even be able to recognize it. It barely produces anything, and it's wild, and it barely does anything. Versus cultivated, over hundreds of years, they've made it to produce corn like we have nowadays. So no farmer would put natural wild corn back in it.
Sissel, stop. But that's fair, Wash. It's harder for us because we don't live in a place where we see olive trees. They're generally native to like Mediterranean regions, so that's not us.
They grow in California. What?
Oh, really?
Yep.
Oh, well, you guys can keep them. Over here in Virginia, we don't have olive trees.
Actually, the California climate is very similar to that in Israel.
Mm. And
Yeah.
I think I've heard that.
Yeah.
But for like a more Western culture, you could make that the case with for us here in Virginia. It's easy to make that with apples, like Onger said. Apples are a great another great one that you can use because it's easy. You can just walk outside and like see an apple tree and understand, putting a branch, grafting a branch into an apple tree is something that you can make a lot of sense of. You just walk outside, there's an apple tree. This one's got apples on it, that one doesn't. Let's take a few of the branches off this tree, put it on this one, so this one will produce fruit. But that's the thing that got me so much about this was this idea that what we do to try to produce more fruit is exactly the opposite of what God did. Because he understood that there's only one source that can produce fruit, and that's himself. And so in order to produce that fruit, he had to break off the branches of in order to produce more fruit, he had to graft in the Gentiles. And as we talked about before, the whole point of the Gentiles was what? Or part of the point of the Gentiles was what? What did we say God was trying to do to the Jews by going to the Gentiles?
Make them jealous.
Yeah. We want some jealous Jews. Yeah. Wash. Nah, 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 nah. We wanted some jealous Jews. The Jews had grown lazy. And we see here that God's plan is to use the Gentiles to make the Jews jealous of God's working in them. And we understand from what Paul says at the end of verse 24, how much more will these, the natural branches, the Jews, what the world?
What?
The Jews will be grafted back into their own olive tree. So we understand, according to Paul, that these Jews are going to be grafted back into the tree. They're going to be returned and restored as God's chosen people. But I love this idea that you really get to understand just what God's up to. And this constant idea of seeing him using things that I wouldn't even think of. And how, once again, the Bible is the greatest commentary on itself. Because it's, like we said, the similarities between Romans 11 and John 15 is just absolutely staggering. Understanding that we need to be a part of that true vine and that solid root that God has been building up since Abraham in order to produce fruit. And as such, that's why the Gentiles are grafted in to this tree. We're not naturally a part of this tree because, well, we're Gentiles. We ain't Jews. There you go. But we have been grafted in by faith into this tree so that we can produce fruit. And that's awesome. So I'm just waiting for Bob. I see him typing. Awesome, like a possum. I got news for you. I've met possums. They're not awesome. I do not remember that line. But yeah, any questions, guys? Anything that I didn't explain clearly? I did my best to try and explain this whole grafting idea, but Reb Zaster is probably going to be better at it than I will. She will almost certainly be better at it than I will.
I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where you're typing, and so I keep interrupting because I don't see where and how to type to you.
Up above the voice channel here, you've got a number of channels. You got Safe Haven, Lounge, Hangout, Meeting Hall, Prayer Request, and then there's the Bible study one.
The things with the hashtags instead of the microphone or speakers.
Yep. So if you just click on hashtag Bible study, you will see all the text chat that's been happening in and amongst these crazy people.
I'm looking. No, I didn't.
Yeah, it's a little confusing at first.
All right, do you see the Bible study with the speaker icon there on the left-hand side where you see Cappy Man and Everett for God and Football and everyone else here?
Yeah, that's what I see.
Okay,
Right.
Scroll up, and do you see the channels under Christian Crew with the hashtags? You got Hangout, Lounge, Memes, Bible Study,
Yes.
Prayer Requests. The Bible
Yes.
Study one is the one we're chatting.
Oh, all right.
Yep, just click
I got
on
it.
There
I got
you
it.
go.
Thank you. All
Working
right.
out kinks. We got this. Yes. Any horticultural questions, please direct at Winged Feet /Rebsaster. She'll do a lot better than me. Any other questions, guys? Any thoughts? Anything you saw that I didn't address or that you think is really cool? You don't. That's true. You did try. You didn't force feed it to me. It was probably good that I had it, but